If you can keep your mic muted while you are not talking, that will be really helpful for the speaker and audience as well. So I'll hand it over to Chanel. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kim. I'm Chanel. Welcome to the forum today. Today we have a session titled Metaphorical Language Policy and Language Politics in the Arabic-Speaking World, and we have the honor of hosting Dr. Lian with us today. Chaoqun Lian is Associate Professor of Arabic Language and Linguistics in the Department of Arabic Language and Culture at Peking University, China. He specializes in language planning and language policy and political and cultural semiotics in the Arab-speaking world. He's the author of Language, Ideology, and Socio-Political Change in the Arab-speaking world, a study of the discourse of Arabic language academies, 2020. He's currently working on a research project, the semiotization and mediatization of political conflicts in the Arab-speaking world. Thank you so much for being with us today. The floor is yours. You can go ahead, Dr. Lian.
Okay, now I can share my screen. Okay, good to see you all. And thank you, Dr. Baconi, for inviting me to this wonderful forum. I can feel the atmosphere, although remotely. So I hope one day in the future I will go to visit you all, and so we can have a open and lively discussion. And today I'm very happy to share some of my thoughts on language politics and language policies and politics in the Arabic-speaking world. I use the term metaphorical, but I do not want to mean that these policies are not real, these politics are not real, they're fake. No, it's not. I just want to use metaphor and how metaphor is understood today in academia to reflect upon the mechanism of language policy and language politics in the Arabic-speaking world. Here is the contents of my talk. It's actually very straightforward. Some preliminary remarks on the concepts and notions, metaphor, language policy, politics, and then I will talk about language as the target. If we consider metaphor as we compare two things, and one is the target, one is the other topic, and the other is the source, the vehicle. We are all very familiar with what metaphor is. Then language as the source, from point of view, language as source. And third is language as the blend. I will use the conceptual integration theory. According to this understanding, metaphor is a blend. It's a new thing, not the original target, not the source or the vehicle. Then some concluding remarks. Okay, begin with metaphor. So here we see, I use the metaphor language family because we are talking about languages. We have language, we have family. Look at the two blue circles. So here, language is the target and topic when we talk about the concept language family. And on the other hand, we have the source, the vehicle, family. So we compare language to family, as if different languages, they are either sisters or they are daughters of a parent's language. So this is the, according to the comparison and association model of metaphor, there are two domains, and we link them together in terms of similarity between the two. This is the traditional metaphor, and also the most common view of metaphor. Then look at the two red circles. So this is according to the conceptual integration theory of metaphor. In terms of cognitive mechanism and metaphor, when we associate two domains together, we actually create four domains. So the other two is the language family, which is the blend space. We blend these two things together. And this new domain, it is not the domain of language It is not the domain of family. It's something new. And there's also a generic space, which describe the, some features that define the blended space, like the lineage and genetic relationship. These are the features. So according to this theory, we understand metaphor as something constructed from both the target and the source, something new. Okay, these are the blue one, the red one. They refer to two different understandings of metaphor. That's all I need for metaphors tonight. Now, let's briefly look at language policy. I assume all of you are very familiar with, because you are all doing works on language policy or related researches. We have a narrow understanding of language policy. What common people understand language policy? These are rules. People, when people talking about policy, these are rules. Guidelines, rules for language structure, use, acquisition, and so on. Well established and implemented in language. That's all. Okay, or in a given speech community or a language community. Then we have Bernard Spassky's understanding or definition of language policy, and he pointing to that language policy consisting of three components. One is language practice, the actual language practice of members of a community, the rule they follow, the variety they choose, and so on. Then we have ideology, the values assigned by members of a speech community to the varieties or the languages they use in their community, and their beliefs, their views about language, and then language planning, the actual intervention into language use by authorities. So all the three components together constitute language policy. So according to this understanding, language policy is a broad sphere of activities, including practice, including planning, including ideology. And this broad understanding of language policy is what I adopt tonight in my talk. And also a very brief description of language politics. This is a working definition. So language politics is about all the power negotiations and the struggles, something that happening outside language actually, because political struggles between interested groups is something that's commonly understood outside the sphere of language. Power negotiations and struggles that involve language as a site, meaning through language, not just the meaning by using the language, but I'm also referring to through the socio-political associations of language, the socio-political meanings of a specific language form, rather than the information delivered by language. So language as a site through language, and or a target, which means the political struggle can about language issues. This is language policy. Now, what's language policy about? Language policy is also part of language politics. That's all for the concepts. Now I can move on to my case studies. I will, first of all, I will talk about language as the target. Now, if we consider the model of metaphor I just mentioned, language as a target or language as the topic. And this is the language-oriented dimension of language policy. I'm going to give a case study which I gave in a published paper of mine in 2018 called Metaphorical Recurrence. I'm going to talk about the case of metaphorical recurrence in Arabic language policy discourse. Okay, first I need to introduce what's about this phenomenon, metaphorical recurrence, Arabic language policy, and Arabic language policy discourse. Here, what I'm looking at is the debates held in those Arabic language academies. These are the official conduits of language policy discussions by renowned Arab intellectuals. And there are a dozen of these language academies in the Arabic speaking world. So the oldest one, the oldest surviving one is in Damascus, the Syrian Science Academy originally, now the Arabic Language Academy in Damascus, and then which was established in 1919. And then we have the Arabic Language Academy in Cairo, which is also opened slightly later in the 1930s. Then we have language academies in Jordan, in Iraq, in Jordan, in Morocco, although the academy there bear a different name. They call it the Bureau for the Arabization. And there are some new language academies recently emerging, like in Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, although they also bear different names. Some institutes call it itself a center for languages or so. So we have those language academies, and scholars or members of these academies usually are across the Arabic-speaking world, meaning that, for example, in the Arabic Language Academy in Cairo, we have members who are Egyptian citizens, but they have also members from across the Arabic-speaking world, from different Arab states. All the Arabic language academies, they have a pan-Arab orientation because they're doing works on the language they share. But they also look inwards towards their own society and with their own considerations and concerns. This survey of the metaphorical recurrence, in this survey, I look at their debates on a specific issue called Arabic diglossia. Diglossia, we all know, is the very typical feature of Arabic language situation across different Arab states. The coexistence of Standard Arabic and Colloquial Arabic as two levels of language use, with claimed linguistic, functional, and status disparities between each other. They are complementary to each other. So this is diglossia, rather than a situation like in China, we have also dialects, but we have Mandarin used in all the domains of public communication. But in the Arabic-speaking world, only very limited, very formal, official domains are reserved for their standard language. And this standard Arabic called Fusha is called Fusha in Arabic. Fusha meaning the most eloquent language. On the other hand, we have this variety called Amiya. Amiya meaning the language of the common people, the most common language. So this language is used. This variety of Arabic, they differ from each other in different Arab states. Usually, their lingua franca in every individual Arab state is the language of the capital. For example, in Egypt, we have the Cairo, the Amiya used in Cairo, which is commonly understood in Egypt, even beyond Egypt, because all the dramas, pop songs are sung in this language. The film and TV industry in Egypt is still quite strong, although they're now facing. What I'm looking at is in the discussion of some leading Arabic language academies from the early 20th century, the 20s, 30s, to the end of the 20th century, I discovered a phenomenon called metaphorical recurrence of those organic metaphors. What is organic metaphor? It sees Arabic and its varieties as living organisms subject to the same force of nature and the same pattern of interrelations as those manifested in the worlds of plants, animals, and human beings. Just imagine languages are living beings. So interestingly, it emphasized the two types of relations between Fusha, Standard Arabic, and Amiya, the Colloquial Arabic. One is the inalienability. They're mutually connected and rely on each other. And the second is antagonism. Well, they attack each other, or Ami attack Fusha. This kind of competition, fight, antagonism. Okay, now I will give you a number of cases of this recurrence. So the first is, if you read quickly, this extract from the discourse. This is a piece of writing given by a member of the Academy, Abdul Qadir al-Maghribi, of the Syrian Academy in 1923. It says, for example, every eloquent human language has on its part a language born of it, which is the colloquial language or the popular language. And the colloquial language is in fact the daughter of the eloquent. And it also says, it is improper to cast the pessimism of the colloquial language to the extent of fighting, destroying, or killing it. You see, there are two metaphors, two types of organic metaphors together in this extract. So I'll give you a very brief context of this piece of writing. And he actually discussed this relationship as part of the issue of promoting Fusha, promoting Fusha as the national language. And this is somehow a common mission of this newly emerging nation states. At that time, Syria was under French mandate, but it has this thriving national awareness, and people there want to create their own state within the territorial territory called Syria, the Greater Syria, with the aspiration for creating a pan-Arab state at that time. So this is promoting a standard national language. And when he is talking about this issue, he's actually referring to the mission of national integration at both state, territorial, and pan-Arab levels. And he used this both the kingship metaphor, emphasizing the family relationship between Fusha and Amiya. And he also used the fight metaphor, although he denied the legitimacy of fighting, but there is an implicit meaning behind this metaphor, showing that people are actually holding a view, at least some people are holding a view that Fusha and Amiya, they are in conflict. So this is the first case. And second, also in 1923, which is interesting, it depicts Fusha like a gorgeous garden with both fruitful and fruitless trees, dazzling their exhibited their dazzling beauty with guardians, blah blah blah. And the Amiya is a big area of thickets that surrounds the garden, mixed with thorns and brambles growing and multiplying in disorderly way. So the thickets are referring to Amiya is the thickets, but thorns and brambles, they are foreign languages, foreign influence. So, but Amiya and the trees in the garden and those thickets surrounding the garden, they share the same soil and water. This is the what we call the garden metaphor. And here it's also contained those two relations. This mutual reliance between Fusha and Amiya on the one hand, and also the difference between Fusha and Amiya. On the other, Fusha is the beautiful trees, and Amiya is the brambles. Okay. The context is that this piece was written by Elias Qudsi, also a member of the Syrian Academy, to refute the suggestion of Latinizing Arabic script published in a French newspaper. And he argued that both Fusha and Amiya, they are legitimate varieties of Arabic. So if you want to use Latin script to write the Amiya, as some people suggested at that time, it will destroy our language. So actually what he's doing is fighting against the so-called colonial conspiracy. And let's look at what is happening in 1957. This is Muhammad Ridwan al-Shabibi, a member of the Cairo Academy. And let's briefly look at his words. He's talking about how the history of Arabic language. He said, many Arabic dialects began to split from Fusha, even if they did not triumph over, they used triumph over their mother in writing and composition. They prevailed, but actually the literal meaning of the word prevail is tyrannized over her. So the relation is tyrannized over her in general conversation, daily communication. And then when he talked about the situation of language at his time, he says, Fusha came out triumphantly with full dignity, triumphantly. So this is all about fighting between Fusha and Amiya. And also it mentions Fusha is the mother of Amiya. So both types of organic metaphors are there. The context, it was in 1957. This is the heyday of Pan-Arabism of Gamal Abdel Nasser. And Muhammad Rida Shabibi is a member of the Cairo Academy. He was making this speech at the annual conference of the Academy. What he argued is we should unify all the Amiyas of Arabic in order to promote linguistic unification around Fusha in the Arabic-speaking world. This is a very radical suggestion, although it was controversial. But at that time, we can understand this is association with Pan-Arabism. So according to this Pan-Arabism, linguistic unification is a natural step towards political unity. And the linguistic fragmentation is a result and also a cause for political fragmentation. So this is the third extract. And the fourth one, now we move to 1978. Also very renowned scholar and Iraqi linguist, Samarra'i, Ibrahim Samarra'i. Samarra'i, his words, we need to re-examine Amiya. He was talking about the situation of dialects in Egypt, in Iraq. He says, because it harms our eloquent language. And he also says, isn't this the marching of Egyptian Amiya against the eloquent language? And things like this are also attested in Iraqi Amiya, which has also attacked the eloquent language. And during this period, there is a tendency for these academicians to use those fighting and war metaphors to describe the relationship between the two languages. And there is a reason for that, because this was what we call the period after the 1967 Arab War with Israel, which obviously is a failure. Okay, they failed, they were defeated. So this caused a deep trauma and a malaise that the Arabs began to suffer following the defeat. So naturally, we see those war metaphors, they came as a flood in their discourse, in their conversation. And 1990, interestingly, this is Tarzi, who is the, at that time, the editor of the official journal of the Cairo Academy. And he says, many elements prevailing in our Amiya stem from the womb of our Fusha. Again, we see the metaphor of mothering, the metaphor of mother and child, when he used the word womb. However, only a few of these elements retain their belonging loyalty to their mother language, whereas the rest have been attacked by deviation, distortion, deletion, addition, as well as baseness and foreignness. Since the spoken variety of Arabic was mixed. And then he continued. Well, as the status of Fusha as a language of science and literature remained safe and well protected, oral communication became the domain of intimate contact between Arabic and the language of Muslim peoples, which led to cross-pollination, that gave birth to a lot of words and phrases prevalent in Armenia. They're talking about history, developments of Armenia. And then he continued in this way. Then in recent ages, our Arabic word suffered various raids on its heartland, followed by raids on our Armenians. You see, now the raids is not about Armenia fighting or attacking Fusha. It's about some enemies attacking Armenia. The tunes are changed. And he calls for bringing he says those forces drove the Armenia away from their uncontaminated eloquent Fusha pedigree. Okay, again, the family metaphor. As a result, there appeared hybrids of Arabic and Turkish, or Arabic and some European languages, and so on. And he called for a reconciliation of Fusha and Armenia. And this time, the context is the waning of Pan-Arabism as a political agenda. So the consolidation of the multi-state system in the Arabic-speaking world and the wave of economic open up and liberalization in favor of the West-led capitalist world system from the late 1970s onwards. So in this context, naturally there is an anxiety over the increasing inward-looking tendencies of the Arab states. Those states, those regimes were blamed for betraying the Pan-Arab dream. So here, this reconciliation of Fusha and Armenia, those metaphor, organic metaphor, changing its tunes from attacking Armenia, attacking Fusha, to enemies attacking Armenia, is a way to compensate for what we have. We would not be able to achieve politically. We can achieve linguistic reconciliation in the fields of language policy to compensate for what we cannot achieve politically or even economically in real terms. And if we look at the context of these those discourse, those pieces of discourse, we see that in the two extracts of 1923, Al-Maghribi, when he gave a discourse in the context of building a coherent national community of Syria in an elitist top-down manner as part of expected unified pan-Arab policy. In the same year, Qudsi, using his garden metaphor, which is in the context of colonial penetration into interior of the Arab land. Then we have the third piece in 1957. This is in the context of political reunion of the Arab nation in line with the ideology of Pan-Arabism. Then we have number 4, the fourth extract, which is in the context of a collective trauma of the 1967 defeat. Then extract 5, 1919, waning Pan-Arabism and consolidated fragmentation of the Arabic-speaking world. We consider these epochal contexts, then we try to find a similarity of those recurrence of organic metaphors. So now we can consider this longue durée context, this long-term enduring context, the persisting rupture between state society, or the elites and the commoners, as a result of the unfinished mission of state social integration in individual Arab states. Then we have this duality of pan-Arab and territorial state national identities as a result of the increasing political fragmentation in the Arabic-speaking world. Then we have this enduring sense of coloniality and external threats in Arab society as a result of the long-term subjection of the region to the hierarchical power relations in the modern capitalist world system. And I argue that it was various longue durée context that caused and produce these metaphorical recurrence. But here, let's bring our topic back to our topic tonight, which is metaphorical recurrence. Here I'm talking about language as a target, language as the topic. And we have this organism as the source, as the something that we compare with. But in the end, we discover that language is actually deeply embedded in politics. It became a reflection of politics. So naturally, we can move to our second topic, seeing language as the source and the vehicle. So this is the politics-oriented dimension of language policy. Again, I will also give a case study, actually a summary of my research on the tendencies, long-term discursive tendencies in Arabic language policy discourse. And this time, language is the vehicle, it's the source. Language, if we understand it, there is a metaphor there. So now language is the source, is a vehicle. But what is the target? What is the topic? And this time, the target topic is actually politics. A brief explanation of the mechanism of the so-called language symbolism. Here, I also use two colors. We have a blue triangle here, meaning a unique human language. We use our language to express the world, to refer to the world, or refer to something in our mind, or via our mind to talk about the world. So this is the referential denotational model of language. But we also have this red triangle here about the socio-political dimension of language, and mediated via ideology, then associate language with identity and power relations. There's an association between language forms, language varieties, language variation, and identity and power relations. So I understand language as this dual system of science unique to human beings. The socio-political meaning is inherent to any language activity. And we have this Anthony Gramsci's famous words. Every time the question of language surfaces in one way or another, it means that a series of other problems is coming to the fore. Okay, so language, I'm here talking about language beyond cognition, beyond communication, and language meaning beyond denotation and reference. This is a socio-political meaning of language as a site of negotiation, as a site of conflicts. So what is the mechanism of language symbolism here? If we consider language as the vehicle, language is used to stand for other things. So language symbolism is actually a stand for type of projection. Language symbolism projects what happens in the social world onto language. So languages and language varieties become symbols that stand for social agents, groups, institutions, and intra and inter-language relations become symbols that stand for power relations between agents, groups, institutions. And the mechanism of language symbolism consists of two processes. One is indexation, and the second is praxification. Indexation naturalized the correlation of the linguistic and the socio-political. So the linguistic can stand for the socio-political. So this is indexation. Nowadays, we have a lot of discussion on indexicality, language indexicality in actual language use, especially in pragmatics, in sociolinguistics. It's a popular terminology, indexicality. This is a way of associating language with the socio-political. Okay, but this is only the first process. We need a second in order to do politics. The second is praxification. It exploits indexical meaning of language to use it as a proxy to do politics through language, in the sense that if we talk about language, it actually becomes a talk about the extra-linguistic world. So this is a metaphorical relation when we're actually using language as a vehicle to stand for politics. My study of the Arabic Language Academy discourse, their debates in the 20th century shows that their continuously discussing three language problems. One is Arabic diglossia, I've already mentioned. And the second is the spread of foreign languages and how we can tackle this spread of foreign languages. And the third is the perceived archaic complexity of Fusha. Fusha became something very difficult to learn, even for native speakers. So how can this language be modernized to express modern concepts, ideas, and to catch up with modernity? So these are the three problems they continuously discussed. But what I discovered from my research is that actually there is deep language symbolism embedded in their discourse, involving those two processes, indexication and praxification, when they talking about these three problems. So the indexication is seeing problems of Arabic as indexes of the socio-political predicaments of the Arabs. Then naturally, praxification, we need to solve those language problems. We're employing language planning as a proxy to engage in socio-political causes, solving socio-political problems via solving language, through solving language problems. So for example, the first problem, Fusha and Amir problem, diglossia problem. So the indexation, the widening gap between Fusha and Amir is correlated with social division and political fragmentation in the Arabic-speaking world. This is what they commonly do in discourse. Then praxification, intra-language integration towards Fusha is expected to foster intrastate cohesion, interstate solidarity in the Arabic-speaking world. So here, the first problem. And second, indexication, the spread of foreign languages, especially English, French in Arab society, is treated as a reflection of Western colonial imperial hegemony over the Arabs in the modern world system. Solution, praxification, recovering the historical status of Arabic and curbing foreigners in the corpus of the language. They're considered necessary to reverse the asymmetrical power relations between the Arabs and the West. So they have something that beyond language to deal with. And the third problems of the modernity fallacy. So the importance of Arabic as an instrument of modern communication, notably in science and education, is thought to be a consequence and an index of the internal decline of the Arab-Islamic civilization and the external threats from Western colonialism and imperialism. Most of them are perceived to continue in the post-colonial period. And praxification, modernizing Arabic, is conceptualized as a process of both catching up with Western modernity and reviving the Arab-Islamic tradition to counter Western hegemony. So these are those common themes I discovered in the discourse of Arabic language academies. Okay, then interestingly, I also discovered three strategies of using language symbolism when we deal with politics. So the first is symbolic compliance, just to comply with. And we talk about language to comply with, justify and support expected change of status quo in the socio-political arena. For example, just give a case. The call for integrating varieties of Arabic around Fusha, I've already mentioned in the metaphorical recurrence case. In the 1950s and 60s, it was to facilitate the formation of responsive citizenry in individual Arab states and the competition over regional ascendancy in the name of pan-Arab unity. So this is a case of symbolic compliance. A second strategy is symbolic resistance. To use language symbolism to battle against the displeasing status quo that is hard to change. For example, if we're talking about the policy of to emphasize on the inalienability between Arabic and the Arab people in the discussion on shall we tackle the issue of the spread of foreign languages. This is actually responding to the preferalization of the Arabs in the modern world system as a reality. this is a structural phenomenon, which is a structural issue, which is very hard to deal with, economically and politically. But what it's doing in their language policy discourse is symbolic resistance, to show that we need to fight against this situation, at least in the domains of language. And the third is symbolic compensation. I've already mentioned in the case on the fifth extract of the metaphorical recurrence, when Pan-Arabism was waning, and the intellectuals, they are still talking about the integration of Fusan Amiya in order to compensate for what they can achieve in the political domain. So this is symbolic compensation, just a quick survey. Okay, here we see a relationship between language and politics, but here language becomes a proxy of politics. And language here, if we use the metaphorical terms, the understanding of metaphor, language is the source. Then we move on to our last topic, language as the blend. So here, from language policy, we move to language politics. When language is as the blend, it's very difficult for us to actually differentiate between what is language or what is properly linguistic domain and what is politics. So language becomes an integral part of politics. This is what I mean by language as the blend. It's impossible for us to separate the two. This is language politics. So you still use the metaphorical terminology, language as the blend. Two case studies of the two rounds of the so-called, from the two rounds of the so-called Arab Spring. One is the Egyptian uprising in the first round of Arab Spring from 2010, the end of 2010, throughout to first half of the 2011. So here I use Professor Bassiouni, Rim Bassiouni's work on a very good case study of the language politics in the Egyptian uprising in 2011. So there's a battle for Sanamiyya in Egypt. We have the Nile TV, when it started to broadcasting the protests. Well, a young man called Tamir, who claimed he was on site. He phoned the Nile TV in a live TV show and TV news program. He said, the protesters, they are foreigners. They speak English language very well. So English language becomes a symbol for their identity. But this is not enough because apparently people are Egyptians. They are using Egyptian Amiya on the ground. Then a couple of days later, the very renowned actress Afaf Shuaib, who was interviewed when asked about the identity of these protesters, she said, London tries to train young men in the Egyptian dialect and to train them in how to with military skills. So here she activated a conspiracy theory because during when Egypt was still a British under British colonial rule, many people call for the elevation of Amiya, the Egyptian Amiya, to the status of official language or national language to replace Standard Arabic. So here, because of the historical correlation, it is easy for this conspiracy to win ground. Okay, and then the protesters fight back. The poet Hisham Juh, at that time he went to Abu Dhabi and joined a competition for the Prince of Poets, which is a live TV show. And he was on the show and he used pure Fusha to and compose a poetry in name of the protesters and talking about the issue of Egyptian revolution. to demonstrating that the young Egyptians who are on the ground, on the square, they are competent in speaking Fusha, the legitimate language of politics. So we are legitimate. We have this political legitimacy to protest. Then after the uprising, when the Mubarak was resigned and removed, and Farouk Shusha, who is a very famous poet, who was then the secretary of the Cairo Language Academy, he wrote a piece of a series of articles praising those revolutionary youth and their attachment to Fusha, and arguing that they are legitimate heir to they have their political legitimacy because they love Fusha, they use Fusha, they attach their Fusha. Unlike the old regime, they always use Amiya to try to attract the people. So you see the fight between Fusha and Amiya in Egyptian revolution became a site for the fight over political legitimacy. And similarly, what happens, the very similar situation happened in Algeria in 1919, what we call the second round of 2019 second round of Arab uprising, when the previous president of Algeria, the former president, Bouteflika, who sought to rule for the fifth term, the run for the election for the fifth term. This is happening in the middle of those the popular uprising. They called Hirak, Hirak meaning popular movement, and he issued a letter to the people, claiming that he would not, announcing that he would not seek a candidacy in the upcoming election. Then there is a reporter from Sky News Arabic who was reporting on the site. This lady, she says, our people are celebrating, they achieved their success. Then a young man came using not the reporter, the lady, she was using standard Arabic, which is used by news reporting commonly. The young man came, interrupting the reporting, and saying that it's Nahuga. It's Nahuga is the Algerian dialect. They call Darija. Darija is the name the Algerians call their colloquial. It's Nahuga, meaning they need to be removed all. They need to go away all. It's Nahuga. Then the lady asked him to, he said, Arabic, Arabic, Arabic. You need to speak Arabic. Then the man says, this is my mother tongue. This is my Darija. And this gesture and the word Nahuga become an icon. Then from the second day on, spread across social media in Algeria, became a symbol of this Hirak movement in 2019. So here again, it's about a language issue between Standard Arabic and Amiya. We know that Algeria, they promote Arabization policy for decades, which actually alienates people who are speaking like Berber language and people who their right to speak use their own Amiya, the Algeria Darija. Language is a very sensitive issue in Algeria. And this time, when the young man says, this is our Darija, and use it Nahuga in a very public announcement in this reporting, actually shows that we are the real Algerians, and the real Algerians are using our own language. So again, the fight between languages, language politics, is becoming the fight over political legitimacy. Very similar situation like what's happening in Egypt. Here, we see language as the blend. So language politics there, the language becomes part of politics. So some concluding remarks. If we reconsider what is the metaphorical, we understand metaphorical as comparison, compare two things, then association, associate two things together, then integration, creating new things out of the two. Create a new thing out of the two. Then correspondingly, we have three types of language politics relations. If we understand it using this metaphorical way, first of all, language as a reflection of politics, what we have seen in our discussion on the metaphorical recurrence case. And then language as a proxy of politics. This is what we see in those language symbolism in the Arabic language policy debates and discussions. And language as an integral part of politics. It's hard to differentiate between language and politics. So these three types. Then we need to ask a question. So why language becomes political in the Arabic speaking world? This is a marked phenomenon in the Arabic speaking world. Language has been endowed with so many meanings. It has become a proxy in so many conflicts and power negotiations in the Arabic speaking world. So Arabic speaking world is rich in language variation, in language sorts of language sociolinguistic phenomena. So these variation give it is also rich in the fighting over the socio-political meaning of languages, which bringing language to the different socio-political conflicts. Tonight I used metaphor to understand this language and politics relations, and I hope this model may other people can apply this model to understanding other language politics issues across the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, in China, and other parts of the world. This is my thoughts I want to share, the thoughts I want to share with you tonight. And here are some readings if you are interested, including my monograph published 2 years ago on the, actually is talking about language ideology and the socio-political change in the Arabic speaking world from the discussion of language in the Arabic language academies. The discussion of language symbolism as a mechanism, including symbolic compensation, symbolic resistance, these mechanisms, I give a systematic treatment in this book. If you're interested, you're very welcome to read. That's all for tonight from my part. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Makoni will initiate the discussion now.
Okay, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. To initiate the conversation, I've got a couple of queries or issues that I would like to discuss with you. I think they will help me think through a number of important issues. The first one is a very general one. It's a very general question. It was the main thrust of your presentation on the language of politics or the politics of linguistic analysis. Where is your research trajectory going? Is it the language of politics or is it the politics of language? Which is the central, what is it that keeps you awake at night? Is it the language of politics or is it the politics of language?
Okay. Shall we answer now? Or?
Yes, it's a conversation,
Okay.
just a sort of
Yes.
a
Excellent.
collegial conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Makoni. This is actually what I want to blend tonight.
Okay.
The politics of language is what I use language policy, what I call language policy tonight. And language politics is something that we use language to do politics. But from my research began with language policy, actually, which is the roughly the politics of language. Then what I discovered in the case of the Arabic-speaking world is that even those policies are language-oriented policies, they are not immune to real politics, to real socio-political concerns. So then I realized actually language policy is part of politics, meaning that even language policy is language politics. We cannot avoid political consideration, political analysis of these policies, only seeing these language policies as intervention to language use or language planning or language reform and so on. There is a purpose or some hidden agenda behind any form of language policy, and somehow driving these policies into language politics. So that's why I try to combine these two domains together. So I start with language policy. I'll start with the debate talking on language, then move on to the association between language and politics, then to proper language politics. I use the term blend because it's very difficult to actually differentiate between the two. These are my quick answer to your question.
Then the second sort of question I want to raise, not so much of a question, it's something that I found quite intriguing, and I think you are best placed to answer this question. You are familiar with the politics of language, or the language of politics in the Arab world, but you are also, I think, familiar with the language politics in China. If you were to do a comparison of how the academies operate in China and how they operate in the Arab world, what insights would you share with us?
Okay, this is a very, I would say, excellent question. As a Chinese doing Arabic language policy, the biggest difference I feel between these the language policies in China and in the Arab world is that those language academies, they are not proper language planners. They're just platforms for intellectuals to discuss language issues and to offer suggestions, recommendations, both for the public and for the for governments. But in China, we have a proper institute, which is the Commission of Language issues. This is the an agency or institute of the government. It actually has far more power than their Arab counterparts. So, for example, we have witnessed a phenomenon which is interesting, that many Arab language academies, especially Cairo Academy and other academies, they suggest that the government should issue a law specifically on language, an Arabic language protection law or something, a law on Arabic language. But their efforts so far hasn't achieved anything. In Egypt, we do not have this law. Only in, for example, in Jordan, in Iraq in the early times, in Jordan recently, and in Qatar, they issued Arabic laws. The only two laws are Arabic in the Arabic-speaking world, meaning that the actual policy or the policy recommendations were not well implemented in the Arabic-speaking world. This is due to many facts. One language, many governments, one language, many regimes. This is one reason, one cause behind that. In China, especially mainland China, we see a very centralized way of policy implementation. So if the government is determined to reform the language, then they just promote a policy, and the provinces, the educational establishments, they will follow the policy. That's why we see that, for example, the standard Chinese, which we call Mandarin in English literature, is well promoted in China. Nowadays, especially the younger generation, if they receive the proper education, primary education, elementary education, primary education, they can speak Mandarin well, and they even use Mandarin in very informal settings. So this is due to the centralized policy making and policy implementation situation in China. So this is the biggest difference. But apart from that, I also saw similarity between language policy discussion in China and in the Arabic-speaking world. So even we see two different policy results, two different kinds of policy results. If we consider China as a success, then the Arabic world might be a failure because we did not see any real-term language reform or something, a language simplification or a script reform or something similar like this. But when they discuss these language issues, they are facing the same thing. I wrote a small section in my monograph. In the conclusion, I use a section to compare these two policy situations. Actually, I saw similarity. I called the anxiety of civilization and anxiety of modernity. This dual anxiety. Both the Arabs and Chinese, they're faced with this dual anxiety. The anxiety modernity, of course, is about catching up with modernity, especially the norm of modernity set by Western society. They need to telescoping the stages that move the West society to modernity. If the West use hundreds of words, hundreds of years, maybe 400 or 500 years, they need maybe tens of years, maybe 100 years to achieve the same level of modernity. This is their modernity anxiety. But on the other hand, there is an anxiety of civilization because in the official historiography in China and in the Arab world, they also emphasize that the Chinese civilization used to be a great civilization in the past, and Arab civilization used to be a great civilization. So now we have this West, modern civilization of the West. So they have this. They want to recover the past status, their golden age, in the modern world. So this dual anxiety pushed them to argue for the same thing. For example, I compare their discussion, the intellectual discussion on the reform of their writing system. In China, we reformed the system. We simplified our Chinese characters, and we promote a kind of a Latinized system to facilitate the acquisition of Chinese called Pinyin. And in the Arabic-speaking world, we witnessed the same discussion, especially in 1940s in Egypt. There are some intellectuals. There's a very renowned scholar called Abdulaziz Fahmy. And he proposed to Latinize the Arabic script, half of the Arabic script, in order to catch up with modernity. And their arguments are very similar because in both their discussions on reform, they mention a hierarchy, a correlation between a hierarchy of languages, hierarchy of script, of writing system, and a hierarchy of civilization and modernity, a hierarchy of nations. And they argue that the most powerful nation, they use alphabets. full alphabets. In the Arabic setting, we know that the Arabic letters, they're what we call abjad. It is a consonantal alphabet. And it's not a fully realized, and the pronunciation of the words are not fully realized in their writing system. And in China, we use these Chinese characters, and people used to argue that Chinese characters are a pictogram. They're pictures. Actually, they're not. They're logogram. They include one Chinese character. They convey a notion, and also they also contain phoneme in the Chinese character, meaning that they both refer to sound and meaning. But then the Chinese intellectuals themselves, they argue that the Chinese character, they are the shackle, that we need to break the shackle in order to modernize Chinese. So here they both mention this hierarchy of writing system and the hierarchy of nations. They are similar. So that's why I call the dual anxiety of modernity and civilization. And I also call it this Orientalism. So this is what the Orients, people in the Orient, due to their common feeling, common experience, they share some similar features. This is not the European Orientalism. This is the Orientalism. So both difference and similarity in terms of the language policy in China and the Arabic-speaking world.
Okay, this is my last question. Then I will give over to Raphael, and I think Ashraf, who is familiar with the Arab world, may want to jump in. Are there a lot of scholars? The question is in two parts, like you who know the Chinese world and Arab world, one question. The second, is there a group of Arab scholars whose main interest is to study the Chinese language policy, like you, but in reverse?
I think there's some connection issues, so I missed a part of your
question. Okay, right.
Can you just repeat?
Yeah, let me repeat. Okay, I'm asking this, that are there any Arab scholars of Arab origin who study China?
Yes.
Who study, yes, I mean, people like you in reverse. Right.
Yes. Although not many,
not
as many as those scholars of Arab origin or Middle Eastern origin in the US, in the States. In China, there is a growing body of Arab scholars. Some of them even choose to work in China. I have a colleague here at Peking University. I think he is a very good example. He is Egyptian.
Yes.
And educated in Department of Chinese, just like I was educated in Arabic. Yes. He was educated in Department of Chinese in Cairo University, then moved to China and did a PhD in computational linguistics. Then he met his fiance, who is a Chinese, and he found China intriguing, interesting, and he decided to settle in China. And now he's applying for like a tenure track position in my university. He is a postdoc now. And he speaks fluent Chinese. He can even read classic Chinese novels without any difficulty. He even supervises our Chinese students in writing essays in Chinese. This is quite unusual for such kind of person or Arab scholars in China. In the past, we only have those what we called Arabs coming to China to teach Arabic. Without a proper degree, without a proper training, but he is different. He also wrote something on Chinese language policy. Sometimes we will have a discussion. And of course, he is in favor of the Chinese way of doing language policy. And he thinks there's much to learn. But I would argue that in my way, I see the Arabic model, Arabic situation is much better because we see flexibility, we see pluralism. So we are sometimes in quarrel. You see, we are all sympathetic with the other.
Okay. I know Raphael is the one who is moderating, but it would be interesting to hear Ashraf, if you jump in, what's your response to this? Yes.
Thank you so much, Chaoqun Lian. I did enjoy the presentation, very organized, very detailed. I need to build on Simfri's points, very interesting points, because talked about politics of language and the language of politics and so on. But before going to Simfri's point, I think one concept which is consistently mentioned throughout the presentation is anxiety. And language anxiety, anxiety and language anxiety in particular. Because Yasser, and by the way, the book in which Lian mentioned, Geography, Language, Politics, and the Middle East. It's a very interesting book in honor of Yasser Suleiman. Simfri and I also wrote about language anxiety in the light of Suleiman's work. I think it's about language anxiety. If you can conclude, if you can just try to summarize the whole thing, it's an ideological language debate which reflects language anxiety, but it's a particular kind of language anxiety, as Suleiman mentioned. It's symbolic kind of language anxiety. It's not the kind of language anxiety which is caused by the instrumental communicative, function of the language. There is language anxiety, but it's not basically about language. It's, as you said, it's through language. It's about politics. It's about inequality. It's about colonialism, and so on. That's the whole. If you can just summarize the presentation that or the argument, your argument, which is very interesting in that way. So the question is, what counts as Arabic? What counts even as language in that context is a political question. It's not a linguistic question. And another thing is that the distinction between language as a topic and language as politics is just for analytic purposes, but at the level of actual practice, as you said or mentioned or hinted, they're combined. And I remember Joseph's famous statement: language is political from top to bottom. Language is always political. The Arabic language academies, it's very interesting to focus on this point. Arabic language academies are patterned after Western language academies. Somehow that influence, the structure itself is somehow shaped by the Western form of language academies. And if the main function of those institutions is ideological, as you said, politics, so I think, in my view, it's very difficult to assess the work of those institutions in terms of success or failure, because their focus is not on language. Their focus is on ideology. See, so we can say, did they do the job, the ideological work in the right way? Is it have they succeeded in bringing on board the politics? Because they want to use that debate to do politics, as I said, by proxy of Arabic. In other words, concretely speaking, is it anti-colonial enough? Is it decolonial enough, the discourse of those institutions, or whether that anti-colonial discourse actually reproduces colonialism somehow by, for example, essentializing Arabic? You see the point? Because we can't talk about proxification unless you essentialize language, you objectify language. That's why metaphor, the metaphorical construction of Arabic comes into the picture. For me, Arabicization is always an unfinished project. There's no way to say, for example, we can have a situation or condition or context in which Arabicization is complete. Why? Because it's symbolic ideological dimension. It's always there. So in one way or another, and I need to see how you react to this point, Arabicization actually is not a killer process. It's just like English. The spread of English is actually animates local languages if we take seriously symbolic ideological dimension. It animates them at the symbolic level. At the revolution, the revolutionary context in the Arab world now, it's very interesting to notice that the question of language disappears. It's not there. Why? Because now the conflict is straight away. I mean, there are demonstrations, there are protests against the regime. We don't need now to do politics by the proxy of language. Now we need to do politics in crude terms. We are on the streets. So now the politicization of Arabic is not there. It's not visible as it used to be before the revolutions in the Arab world. And this again raises questions about language planning, language policies from the grassroots. Thanks so much again for there are many thoughts actually about the presentation. Thank you. So over to you, Rafael. Yes, you can react to what I said. Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, many of your points I totally agree with. Symbolism, ideology, language anxiety, and very interesting writing on language anxiety of Yasser Suleiman, who was actually my supervisor of my doctoral thesis. So I share many of these thoughts and inspirations from him on this issue, language politics. And commenting on the question of Arabic language academies as a model on the Western model, the institution itself, that's, this is correct. And the model is the French Academy. French Academy is a model of success, which is followed by many language academies, especially Arabic language academies. They copy the structure, they copy even the membership rules and arrangements and their ideology, language purism, language protection, and many things. But interestingly, I noticed two things. One is that when they actually talk about history of Arabic language academies, some of the academies, they trace their origins to to ancient Greece, to Plato, then to those grammar schools. There are two schools according to the Arabic grammatical tradition, and they trace their origin to those schools, those like intellectual salons in the Islamic times. And this is one thing. They want to emphasize their sovereignty over their language academy. And this is a very interesting issue. On the other hand, I noticed that there are some of the Arabic language academies, although they join there is a body called the Union of Arabic Language Academies in the Arabic-speaking world. Although they join the union, they acquire membership of the union, but they did not call themselves academy. They even some of them call them council, some of them call them center, and other names. So actually, they want to build a new structure, not trying to copy the French Academy model. Maybe do something different. This is just some comments on the structure. So whether there is still decolonization going on, even in terms of the language planning, language planners, the nature of their language planners? This is a very interesting question. And about the question of languages, whether they disappear in politics, this is exactly what's my point. When we talk about language as a proxy, I give the case of approximation of language in the discussion on language policy. So when we look at language policy, still these are debates over language, for the language, about language. But actually, they are doing things not just about language, but beyond language. So this is proxy. But these kind of debates, they became secondary in socio-political conflicts, especially in the case of Arab Spring. In 2012, when I did my field work in Egypt, I interviewed staff and members of the Cairo Academy, and I acquired minutes of their discussion, of the members of discussion during the uprising. And those members, they were concerned over the preferalization of language issues, language policy issues during the uprising. But what we see, on the other hand, is language as a blend. This kind of phenomenon is coming. Now, just the cases I give in the fight over political legitimacy via language, in the case of Egypt, in Algeria, they were happening on the ground within the uprising. They are not about language maintenance. They're not about language reform, but the politics is doing through language. So this is the language as a blend. This is what I talk about, language as the blend. You cannot tell what is language policy, what is language politics. They are just together, they are there. And people naturally use language, deploy language to do politics without even considering this is a proper form of language policy or language planning. And here language becomes an integral part of language politics. So for me, the question of languages, yes, they disappear, but language did not disappear in this conflictual situation. Language exists as the blend, and the blend is called language politics, not the politics of language, not language policy. These are some quick thoughts, replies to you.
Yeah. Can I just come in, please, to clarify a point? When I said that the language academies, you're absolutely right. They would not recognize that the history of the history which shaped the Arab language academies actually is, is a Western history. It's, that they were influenced or shaped by the Western Arab language, Western academies. We will not recognize it. In Arabic tradition, Arabic language tradition, actually, the language planning has a history there. As you said, even in the first period of Islam, they were language planning, some at the level of codification. They codified Arabic and they codified other sciences through the codification of Arabic itself. Entirely agree. But if we take the first Arabic Language Academy in the Arab world, which is the Syrian Arabic Language Academy in Damascus, as you mentioned, it was established in 1919, right?
Yeah.
And that's the context of decolonization, right? From the West, and even or against Turkification, as we know. So to a large extent, we can only think, or can say, we can largely think about Arabic language practices and academies within that colonial context, Western colonial context, to understand it well. We cannot link or de-link. Or in other words, Arabic language academies and language planning itself are entangled with those colonial and decolonial or anti-colonial processes. We cannot isolate them somehow. That's why politics is always there in the Arab world. And the final point is, which is mentioned in a passing, is about the mother tongue. Now we have standard Arabic, it's called Fusha, sometimes people say, you know, as you know, they divide the standard into Fusha and Classical Arabic and Quranic Arabic and so on, Standard Arabic and so on. And of course, this distinction itself, you know, within the Standard Arabic is a Western invention, as we know. In the Arab world, or they recognize only Arabic, the state Arabic language, that's it. And even they demonize this thing, they demonize the colloquial, the dialect, as you said, the Ammiya, as a way to maintain the integrity of the language, you know, as one monolithic code. But and very interestingly, they do not conceptualize the standard as a foreign language, although it's learned in the school. It's very interesting, and this is one way of critiquing the notion of mother tongue as a foreign language, that distinction as it is conceptualized in the Western literature, in psycholinguistics and Western literature. And Yasser Suleiman also worked on this point, on this issue in more details. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ashraf, for posing your initial questions. And I see that Cécile has raised her digital hand.
Yes, thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. It's interesting that you mentioned the Académie Française, because that's what kept coming to my head when I started I started listening to the first part of your talk. I'm just going to make a quick comment on the Académie Française, and I'll ask my question. So what is very interesting in the Académie Française, so it was founded 1635 by Cardinal Richelieu. But what is very interesting at the beginning, it has nothing to do with language. Actually, it was a way to regulate public discourse in France in 1635. And it was a way to having intellectuals, mainly writers, sponsored by the state. So having been given money by the state in order for them to tame, you know, their critique of the state. So basically, the Académie Française, when you look at the history of the Académie Française, they didn't really work. I mean, their initial really mandate, I would call it like that, was not really about language. It came actually along the way. What is also very interesting to know that in the Académie Française, there is no linguist. So most of the people, and historically, there is no linguist, even until now. So historically, they are mainly writers, you know. So just, yeah. That's just a comment, and to build up on Ashraf's point, I was wondering to what extent it would be interesting to look at the discourse you studied as a discursive genre, you know. So basically, a discursive genre that you see across different, you know, academia in the world. Okay, and a way, because when you analyze the discourse that is produced in the Arabic world, there are lots of similarities with the ways in which it is articulated in the French context. The enemy is different. The enemy is English. You know, and so, but there is. It seems to me that there is a discursive genre that you find, you know, in order to basically ratify the discourse that is produced as the discourse of language policy, you know. And maybe a third point. I wonder to what extent this discourse has an impact on the regimentation of language, because nobody cares about the Académie Française in France, and the Académie Française actually doesn't regiment the ways in which people use language. Most of the French people are not aware of what's going on in the Académie Française. It's a very abstract kind of idea. So 2 points about the discursive genre, And the second point about the effects of this kind of discourse on the regimentation of language in the public sphere. Thank you.
Excellent questions, especially the stories of the early mission of this French academy. And they're used to tame languages. There's no linguists. I think a bit of similar situations also occurring to those Arabic language academies. They also include people who are renowned scholars, but not those professional linguists. But yes, they do have the professional linguists, but they have philosophers, writers, and religious scholars, and just people from all around the society who are dealing with language, because language for them is the basis of knowledge. And this is the idea, I think. Maybe it also has a lineage from the French Academy. Just a quick comment on this. About the discursive genre, actually, what I was treating the Arabic Language Academy discourse in my monograph, I actually name it Arabic Language Academy discourse. I would agree that this might be a genre, and also try to compare this kind of language policy discussion with something that I'm familiar with. And I've already introduced a comparative study between the Arabic language policy discussion and Chinese one. So this might be a genre because people use very similar arguments or even similar discursive strategies, even similar phrases, similar metaphors to describe language situation, to talking about very similar language issues, or to asking the same language questions. A comparative study of this kind of discourse in the Arabic setting and in the French setting will be very inspirational. And maybe in the future we can discuss this discursive genre. But what is important is that any discourse is living in context, in reality. We need to consider the actual context that bring about these discourse. I assume there are some structural similarities between, for example, the discussion of French and English in France, and Arabic and English, French in the Arabic-speaking world, about the world system, about the hierarchical relationship between world languages, and scapegoating some of the corrupted use or some deviating use of language for bringing in foreign elements into our beautiful language. So these are very similar contexts, the sense of being preferalized, the sense of being dominated by the powerful other. These are some structural similarity in terms of the context, but the actual political, socio-political context I assume are still very different. So even if we consider it as a genre, we still need to see, to look at their different revelations, different production of this genre in the Arabic setting, the French setting, the Chinese setting. But I agree with you. I think this is a genre, because when we talk about language policy, we often talk about the real policy, language planning as a behavior and how it can change people's life. But just as Ashraf pointed out before, the mission of these language academies, probably their mission is not to regulate language use in real terms, but to continue the debate, continue the discourse. Their mission is discourse making. What they make together is this genre, discursive genre. And talking about the effects and influence of this genre, of this discourse, Arabic language policy discourse or Arabic language academy discourse or language academy discourse on the actual language use. If we still use the model of Bernard Spassky, it's his model of language policy, he considered language ideology as a component and language practice as a component. So it is not necessarily for language ideology to influence language practice. People can say one thing and doing things in a different way. Just like many, for those Arabs who are in favor, support the spread or the promotion of Fusha, they still use Amir in their daily life. So practice and ideology, they can go different ways. It's natural for discourse to exert their effects not on language practice, but on ideology, on discourse. So if you can ask people, what's your view, your attitudes, you do survey of attitudes on language, but they can speak language, use language in a very different way. So when we talk about effects and influence on language, I think even in those, like the situation in China, we see that we have a very seemingly very successful language policy. We have a nationwide lingua franca now, and people, standard language, people can use it. But still, in terms of ideology, people support the national language. But in real terms, at home, there's nostalgia towards their local dialects, and people are concerned about the young generation. They're not able to speak their dialects, use the colloquial in a correct way, in a proper way. There are much more complicated thinking and conflicts going on behind this official ideology. So the influence, I would say, as you have already mentioned, people do not care about those language academies, French academy, Arabic language academies. I think a similar situation is in the Arabic speaking world as well. The terminologies they produce, the people do not use or not know and are not aware of. And each year, the Cairo Academy will hold an annual conference. And only when the conference was open, the media and the newspaper will report something on Arabic Language Academy. Apart from this week or this month, there's nothing about, no information about the work of these Arabic Language Academies. This is what I call, but still people can easily formulate the arguments and the ideological positions of the language academies. According to what the interview I conducted with the common people on the Egyptian streets, people can easily give very similar arguments that the language academy give. So this is what I called the banality of language policy. It's like just banal nationalism. These ideas are there, but people are not aware of. People are not aware of their existence because they're natural given in their society. They are the doxa in their community. People just naturally follow these ideas. So in this way, they do not need those language academies to reaffirm or to educate, to teach them, to talk about this. They themselves can speak the same thing. But politically, symbolically, the debates need to go on. That's why we need those language academies to continue to organize conferences, to publish the journals, and then promote their ideas, promote the doxical views of language in their community. This is a part of, I think this is a way to maintaining political legitimacy and to maintain even sovereignty in the sense of the citizens in individual Arab states, according to the cases I'm familiar with. I'm not sure whether this is a similar situation in France or in other parts of the world. Yes, these are my answers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ashraf and Cécile, for your questions and comments. I see that Marconi has raised his actual hand.
Yes, I want to shift the discussion a bit, and I want to try this argument on you, that for the Chinese government, language policy is part of their foreign policy. Does that make any sense? Before I give you more evidence, if I were to say to you that internationally, the Chinese language policy is part of the Chinese foreign policy. Right. For example, you have a lot of these Confucian centers which have been established across the globe by the Chinese government. And I think they are part of the Chinese foreign policy. So for the Chinese government, language policy is not really part of educational policy. It is part of what? Their foreign policy, right? Which is controlled and centralized, because the Confucian centers in different parts of the world are more or less identical. They use more or less identical language teaching materials, and ways of teaching are more or less identical. So from that perspective, the Chinese government must ideologically believe that language policy furthers its own role and functions politically, geopolitically. I mean, I'm trying to make sense of why would the Chinese government invest so much in Confucian centers and in learning of Chinese and teaching of Chinese across the globe, if they did not see that as tied to their own geopolitics.
Yeah, of course, I agree with the point. Then you bring language policy issue to not linking to internal politics, but to foreign policy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Because that is where it becomes interesting to bring in Cécile or even Ashraf. Was, for example, the Académie Française and its role and status outside France, for example. What is its significance and what role does it play outside? What role do these academies play outside, let's say France, outside China, for example, the Confucian centers? Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yes. Jump in.
I think, Makoni, I think I wouldn't talk about Académie Française, but I would talk about Alliance Française, the British Council.
Oh, okay.
You know,
okay.
I mean, that's, I think it's what is it called for the German, there is, there is a German counterpart. So it's more about that.
Yes. It's more about them. Yes. Okay. I agree. Yes. I agree. Yeah.
This issue, correct, is about a different set of organization, just like British Council, Chaoqun Institute, and now we have Confucius Institute. And the Confucius Institute, as we have already read on newspaper, is now facing crises in different countries. This is, of course, part of the, strategically speaking, this is part of China's foreign policy in order to build China's soft power in the world. And then we realized that we need to learn the model of, for example, the Chaoqun Institute, British Council, and to meet the need of people living in foreign countries, their need for studying Chinese, and at the same time to spread the Chinese language, Chinese culture. The Confucius Institutes, they run differently in different countries. This is interesting. In Africa, the model of this is one Chinese university, they will collaborate a foreign university in establishing one Confucius branch of Confucius Institute in this foreign university on campus. Then they collaborate. And this is part of the soft power building. But as you all know, China nowadays is facing challenges across the world in terms of their strategy, those kind of projects. And in some country, the Confucius Institute were asked to close because they thought this is a kind of ideological penetration. But no people are talking about the closure of Cotton Institute, the closure of British Council. What's the reason behind that? I think that it is interesting to think about this. But on the other hand, we see, for example, in the Arabic-speaking world, we see in Saudi Arabia, we see in the Emirates, because they want to balance their foreign policy, make a balanced kind of decision in terms of their foreign policy. On the other hand, they rely on America, the US. They let the US to use their land to build military relationship and still maintain very good diplomatic relation as allies of the US. And on the other hand, it looked towards the East. So they introduced the Chinese language in their national educational system. They brought a number of Chinese teachers into their school. And this is outside the Confucius Institute system, because this is their own initiative. They see that in the future, we need to not to make a choice between, for example, US and China, but we need to make a balance between the two. So we need them both. They embrace Chinese language teaching as their own initiative, not as the China's foreign policy. We also need to talk about, when we talk about Confucius Institute as China's strategy, part of Chinese foreign policy, we also need to talk about the situation now in the world. People, for some countries, they consider the rise of China as inevitable, and they want to cooperate and tackle this scenario. That's why they embrace Chinese language. They're prepared for future generations as their own initiative. These two phenomena we need to consider together. So this is not only a foreign policy issue. This is about a changing global scenario, and language is part of this structural change. So French used to be the global language, then it gave place to English. And nowadays, people are talking about whether Chinese will become the global language in the future. And we see that language are always involved in those, not only foreign policy, but the structural change, the bigger structural change in the world. Yeah, this is what I want to comment on this issue.
Okay, let me, Raphael, sorry to jump in. I want to try and draw in some of our colleagues who have been very quiet here, like Alja, Katrin, Alberg, and then move on to Phoebe, and then move on to Cliff and Vishna. Katrina, what's your view about this? How does this sound? I'll just be, okay, Professor Bishop has gone. Phoebe, what's your view about the discussions that have been taking place?
It's been stimulating. I've just been thinking of, I'm from Ghana, and thinking of language policy here. I think the part that got me thinking is how the politics of language versus that comparison, but the fact that when we're doing language policy, it's not just cognitive and communication, but there's the fact that we mentioned language, we're bringing so many other discourses into the arena. So I've been looking at the implications of that in my work, as in, okay, I'm looking at school, language policies in school, but what other things, by implication, what other things am I touching? In your presentation, you talked about, the violent, the metaphors that language is playing on. So it just got me thinking about, on the surface, I'm doing work on language policy in the classroom, but then what other issues in the Ghanaian community am I unconsciously touching? So yeah, that's
okay. Good. Okay, Vishna, what about you? What's your view about this? What is it that you found striking?
Well, I think the kind of building on what Stevie said, I think the way that we view like language families as a metaphor is also has implications for language ideology. For instance, so I grew up speaking Serbo-Croatian, and after the split in Yugoslavia into separate countries of Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, etc., now I could claim to speak, like if I wanted to, I could claim to speak Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, etc. And yet these languages are so similar. And so I think one thing that struck me as well with these metaphors of like language families and such is how they have implications for our ideology as well. About like the separateness versus distinctiveness versus similarity between language.
That's interesting. Okay. Then Cliff, what did you find striking?
Okay, I think I would like to just comment whether you're talking about the language of politicians as language politics, in the sense that politicians will speak in a particular way towards the masses so that they can gain popularity, even if it means using a language that is not English, but an African language, so that they can gain their support or be voted in terms of whatever policies they want to implement. I don't know if you can comment on that. And then the other part I wanted to also mention was whether the route of writing down language policies is beneficial when compared with the academies that you are talking about. Because in South Africa, we don't have maybe those academies for some of the marginalized languages. Whether such a model may help uplift or develop African languages in some way. Those are my two thoughts. Yeah.
Okay. Then Chanel, do you want to say anything about this?
No, I think colleagues have covered all the interesting questions. I think it was a very interesting presentation, and on the point that Cliff made on these types of academies, there is a push in the new language policy for higher education to have various language centers instituted in higher education institutions, and per province. So I mean, I don't always agree with this territorial way of looking at having these centers develop a particular language in a particular province in a university, because then we need to ask very interesting questions about what universities mean to do. So yeah, thank you for your presentation.
Okay. Thanks. What about Kim?
Well, I'm thinking about how we were talking about the British Council and the other institutions that operate outside of their countries of origins for foreign language study. And I've taught English outside of the US in a lot of capacities, but a lot of them were through the US government, through the State Department, and other governmental organizations. So it's kind of interesting to ask the question, is this a language project? Is this a political project? Is this an ideological project? It's kind of hard to really parse out which is which, especially when all of these institutions, a lot of them are so closely tied to foreign diplomacy and things like that. But yes, lots to ponder.
Thanks a lot. Then Michael Scott. Mike, what do you think? Do you have any comments to make? I think Mike is gone. Basi, do you want to round up before we get back to Raphael? Oh yes, Scott, what's your view? How does this come across from Sweden?
So my one of the things that I find interesting about, and it's not necessarily something that was brought up very strongly in the discussion about Arabic language policy, but the ways in which kind of the link between a nation and a language is naturalized, and the nation is produced as being monolingual somehow, and of course that's something that's very much a phenomenon in Sweden and the language politics of Sweden, where Swedish is a multilingual country, but the discourse since a new group of immigrants came in since 2015 has all been about, in order to participate in the society, they must speak Swedish. They must, and then in order to become citizens, they have to speak Swedish. So rather than being a moment in which a country can rethink itself as a multilingual space with different ways of speaking and thinking about language, it becomes this, a naturalized link that, to be a citizen here, you have to speak this one particular official variety.
Yes, good, thanks. Vishna, then Christine, then we can round up.
Yes, I just had a quick question going off of what Scott's comment. I wonder if you could speak to sort of China's promotion of Mandarin over other varieties such as Cantonese, etc., and kind of your views on that. I'd be curious to know.
China's promotion of Mandarin in Africa? Are you
just like, for instance, from my understanding, varieties such as Cantonese and other Chinese varieties are not promoted very much, right?
Yeah, there is, of course, a tension between the Mandarin Standard Chinese, which is based on Beijing accent, and other dialectal groups of China, especially Cantonese and Shanghainese, those, I would say, prestige Chinese dialects. There's always tension there. But now people emphasize the value, emphasize their loyalty to their location, to their dialectal area and their local identity. But at the same time, why they need to do so, this is not just because of the promotion of Mandarin at the cost of local dialects. This is because the Mandarin as a Chinese, as Standard Chinese, has been well established. And the issue somehow is settled because the Mandarin teaching policy is very well accepted and implemented at all levels of education. That's why in this context, people started to argue for their local identity in order to protect their language, as if the languages are resources and need to protect. Without the establishment of the scenario that the standardization Chinese, without the benefits that people get from the standardization Chinese, there will be no room for such discussion debates to support and to protect and promote local dialects. So what I see is not tension synchronically, but a diachronic development of Chinese language policy. We have stages. Now we are in a much more mature stage. We promote kind of what we call Chinese language and script. The commonly used Chinese language and the script across China. This is the new name we give to the standard language and the standard writing system, meaning that it is mature enough, it is well established enough. Now at this stage, then we can talk about protecting minority language, protecting dialects. So this is a tension, not synchronically, but the different stages of language policy in China.
Okay, then there's Christine. Christine is in Brazil.
Yes, thanks. Just a brief comment on the role of academies. Hello, that was fascinating, the debate. Thanks a lot. I was wondering about the role of Camões Institute in Portugal that is dedicated to the promotion of Portuguese language and Portuguese culture on behalf, of course, of the government of Portugal. But it's interesting that it did not flourish in Brazil. And actually, Brazil, as a former colony, has also created its own projects to spread the idea of Brazilian Portuguese. There is a competition on who defines what counts as Portuguese in international scenario. But Portuguese still insists on the argument that the Brazilians do not use Portuguese adequately, correctly, even though people in the world are really interested in this idea of Brazilian Portuguese. So it's really interesting to see how things may get somehow confused when we talk about power relations between the colonies, the former colonies, and this idea of the colonial language policy and planning. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Oh yeah, then Michael Scott, you've raised your hand.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating and inspiring presentation. As somebody who's been studying Arabic for 30 years, it really revived my interest because recently I've been immersed in studying Swahili and have been exercised by the pan-Arab and pan-Bantu or pan-African comparison. Arabic as a lingua franca between, throughout the Arab world and beyond, the Islamic world. And then as I'm studying Swahili and seeing how it's used by my neighbors here in Maine in the United States, who are from Rwanda, Burundi, Angola, and Congo, and all speak a bit of Swahili in addition to their local languages. And so this whole presentation has really revived an interest in trying to explore the parallels between Swahili, where I don't believe there is a language academy. There may well be. Other countries in East Africa refer to Tanzania as the center of the proper Swahili, what they call Sanifu Swahili, which is kind of like the Fusha in Arabic. So these kind of parallels really have been fascinating, and they've been swimming in my mind has been swimming in this whole sea. And I'm very grateful for the presentation because I need to get back into the Arabic after 30 years. I mean, I realized that I can never learn to master Kiswahili at the same level that I've been able to come to grips with Arabic, at least in one or two dialects, and to some extent Fusha. Yeah, I kind of had to abandon the Arabic a little bit to get into the Kiswahili, which of course has tremendous influence from Arabic, as well as other languages. And the other point that came to my mind was that Kiswahili, to my mind, is very parallel in a way to modern Arabic, where the differences have, or the political differences, as I pointed out, have kind of disappeared because of the context of politicization, or to some extent, maybe globalization. Swahili is noted for its ability to incorporate many different languages into common use, and even academic use and scholarly use, in a way that happens now in Arabic, but there are differences. So anyway, this has been very inspiring, and it's really revealed that I have a lot of work and thinking to do ahead. Thank you so much.
Thanks, man. Thanks. Yes. Kim or Vishnu, do you want to tell us what is next?